Hi everyone, and welcome back to the channel. There's a point if you stay in Korea long enough where something shifts, and it's not something you can really plan for or even notice right away. It's more like one day you realize that things you used to think about all the time, you just don't think about anymore. And it's not because everything suddenly becomes comfortable or easy or familiar in the way that you imagined it could. A lot of the differences are still there. You just learned how to live with them in a way that doesn't take as much effort. Of course, everyone's experience here is going to be different. Some people settle in quickly, others don't, and for some people, it never quite feels like home in the way they expected. But if you've been here long enough, and especially if you've seen the country change over time, you start to notice that feeling settled isn't really about everything fitting perfectly. It's more about how much energy it takes to get through your day. I remember when even simple things felt like they needed your full attention. Something like going out to eat wasn't automatic. You'd look at the menu, pause for a second, think about what something meant, how it might come out, how you were supposed to order it. There was always that extra step in your head. And then at some point, without really noticing when it really happened, that step just disappears. You walk in, order, eat, and leave, and you don't think about it anymore. Work was probably one of the biggest adjustments. In the beginning, there were always small moments when you weren't completely sure what was happening. A meeting ends, and you're not entirely sure if something has been decided or if it's still open. Someone says something indirectly, and you're trying to figure out what it actually means. And early on, that can be tiring because you're constantly reading between the lines. But after a while, you start to recognize those patterns. You understand how things move, even if they're not said directly. And once you reach that point, work doesn't necessarily become easier, but it becomes more manageable. Even day-to-day things follow the same pattern. Setting up a bank account, dealing with deliveries, figuring out how certain systems work. At first, there's always that sense that you're slightly outside of it, like you're using something that wasn't really designed for you. But over time, that feeling fades. Not because the system changes, but because you've seen it enough times that it stops feeling unfamiliar. At the same time, there are things that don't completely settle in the same way, and I think relationships are one of the biggest ones. When you first arrive, for some people, it can feel surprisingly easy to meet people. There's always somewhere to go, someone to talk to, and something happening, and connections form quickly. But after a few years, you start to notice how often those connections change. People leave, new people arrive, and the same conversations happen again in slightly different ways. And after a while, you adjust to that. Not in a negative way, but in a more realistic way. You stop assuming everything will last, and you start appreciating the connections that stay consistent, even if they're fewer. And I think those relationships, even if they're smaller, start to feel more meaningful, because they're not just part of a moment, they're part of your routine. The pace of life also feels different over time. At the beginning, everything feels fast, and you feel like you're trying to keep up with it. But later on, you realize you don't have to match that pace all the time. You start choosing when to move quickly and when to slow things down. You take a longer walk instead of the fastest route. You sit a bit longer instead of moving on right away. Even convenience, which stands out so much at the beginning, starts to feel less important. At first, it feels like something you should take advantage of, how easy everything is, and how quickly things can be done. But later on, you don't always choose the easiest option. You choose what feels better in the moment. And those small choices start to shape your experience more than anything else. I think that's when things begin to feel more settled, not because everything has changed, but because you've stopped trying to adjust to everything. Another thing that changes over time, and I don't think people talk about this enough, is your relationship with the language. In the beginning, everything feels difficult. Even basic conversations take effort, and you're constantly translating it in your head. But later on, you reach a point where you can function without thinking too much about it. You can order, ask questions, and handle daily situations. And from the outside, it probably looks like you've fully adapted. But there's also a kind of plateau that can happen, where you understand enough to get by, but not always enough to fully express yourself in the way you would in your own language. And that gap never completely disappears. You just get used to living with it. Daily life also becomes more predictable, which can be comforting, but also a bit strange at times. You find yourself going to the same places, seeing the same patterns, and moving through the same routines. And that repetition is what makes things feel stable. But at the same time, There are moments when that routine can feel a bit isolating, not because you're alone, but because everything feels so familiar that you stop noticing it. And I think that's something people don't expect, because when they imagine living abroad, they picture constant change. But in reality, feeling at home often comes from doing the same things over and over again. There's also a kind of cultural distance that never completely disappears. Even after years, there are still moments where you realize that your way of thinking doesn't fully match what's happening around you. It's not always obvious, and it doesn't usually cause problems, but it's in there in small ways, in conversations, in expectations, and in how people react to certain situations. But over time, you stop trying to resolve that difference. You just accept it as part of your experience here. Korea really doesn't change to meet you, but over time, you learn how to exist in it without thinking about it as much. And I think that's really what home becomes after a long time. Not a place where everything makes perfect sense, but a place where you don't need to question everything anymore. And I don't think it's something you can really explain until you've gone through it yourself. But once it happens, you start to see the same place in a completely different way. Let us know in the comments, when did Korea start feeling home to you? And if you like this kind of content, please like and subscribe to our channel. I'll see you in the next video.